Welcome to Books in the World, a production of the Cape Cod Writers Center, and I'm Laurie O'Neill, your host today. Books in the World is an interview show that showcases writers, illustrators, publishers, editors, and others in the literary field. The Writers Center was established 57 years ago, and Books in the World has been broadcasting continuously for 41 years. We sponsor a 4-day annual summer conference, which, like this interview, will be virtual this year due to the pandemic. And today we are delighted to welcome Jennifer Dupee, author of The Little French Bridal Shop. Welcome, Jen, and thanks for coming.
Laurie, thanks so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here and share the book with your viewers.
We are so excited. So I'm going to share a little bit about your bio, and then I'm going to invite you to add more. So Jennifer is the eldest of a set of fraternal triplets, and she grew up seeking any quiet corner of the house so that she could read, write, and work on puzzles. Her lifelong passion for old houses inspired Elmhurst, the grand home featured in her debut novel, The Little French Bridal Shop, which was just published by St. Martin's Press this March. Jen's a graduate of Brown University, where she received her honors in creative writing and is an active member of the Grub Street writing community in Boston, and she's published in the Feminist Press. She was a semifinalist for the 2016 James Jones First Novel Competition and a semifinalist for the 2016 Faulkner Wisdom Competition. Jennifer lives in a historic house just outside of Boston with her family and is currently at work on her next 2 novels. Can't wait, Jen. Her goal with her writing is to make you laugh, cry, and think a little more deeply about the world and the people around you. And Jen, you accomplished that with me reading this book, all of those emotions. There were so many emotions I experienced in this book. I was so delighted to read it. And it was filled with so many twists and turns. It was shocking. It really was. But what really struck me was your ability to weave the cycles of life and death throughout the narrative, as well as the many shapes of love and the tenuousness of our time here. And I can't wait to dive in with you and our listeners. So Jen, please tell us a little bit about your inspiration for The Little French Bridal Shop and maybe something about the plot, setting, and your main characters.
Sure. So, writing for me often starts with images and setting. I'm a very imagistic, descriptive writer. And so, in this case, it was really sort of setting and image. So, my grandmother lived for many years in the North Shore community of Beverly Farms, Massachusetts. And it's a place that's really deeply instilled in my psyche, and one I really drew on as I created the fictional town in my book and embarked on the opening pages. So I had this sort of vision of like a regal house up on the hill. The North Shore of Boston, once upon a time was sort of the summer community for Boston Brahmins. So people from the Back Bay of Boston would travel out there for the summer to be there in their houses. And so I had this vision of sort of this regal house kind of up on a hill. And so I knew about the house, but I didn't quite know what the story was yet. And just a quick tangent on the house. I've always had a love for old houses. And when my husband and I first started dating, I realized he had a love for old houses as well. And we would often take walks down a nearby road called Elmhurst Road and admired this historic house that was there. And so as I embarked on the opening pages of the book, I named my house Elmhurst in tribute to that house on Elmhurst Road. Yeah. And then the other image that came to mind, I had started kind of the opening pages. I had the house, but I didn't quite have the story. And I had treated myself to a writing weekend in another seaside North Shore town called Rockport. I was sitting there in the little Emerson Inn in their dining room, and I was about to embark on what I hoped would be, some meaningful writing into this new work that I was starting. But I was totally distracted by this large pattern, repeating pattern of pheasants in the wallpaper.
Oh, yes.
And
in the book. It's in the book, everybody.
And it's in the book, right. And so I couldn't keep my eyes off the wallpaper. And I couldn't stop laughing when I looked at it. And so I began to write the pheasants wallpaper into the book. And so one of my first scenes started there, where Larissa, my main character, takes a crowbar to the wallpaper in an attempt to uncover an apparent leak. And she's not quite herself, she's, taking a crowbar was maybe a drastic, step. And you can see that she's struggling with something. And I kind of had a sense of what that might be, but as the book evolved, I drilled down deeper and deeper on what that was and what was really bothering her.
Hmm. Tell me a little bit more about the house and who owned the house. Aunt Ursula was fascinating to me.
Thank you. Yeah.
Loved
So
her.
right. So the story is set in motion by when Larissa Pearl returns to her small seaside hometown upon the death of her great aunt Ursula.
Hmm.
And as I mentioned, she's in a bit of emotional mess. And I'll get back to your question, but um, she, on a whim, though she's recently single, she's lost her job and she's struggling with her mother's failing health. And on a whim, she wanders into the local bridal shop and purchases a dress, though she has no groom. And then word spreads all over town that she's getting married. It's this insular small town.
Hmm.
And rather than do anything to dispel the rumor, she perpetuates it and kind of small town chaos ensues. But
Hmm.
right, the reason she returns is because her great aunt Ursula has died, and Ursula has been the nonagenarian. Is it what's the nine
Oh,
version of
octogenarian.
yeah, yeah. Well,
Mhm.
so she's in her 90s when she dies, and she's been the owner of this house for many years. And she, even though she isn't there during the present action of the book, she's really present in the book through sort of flashback and memory. And I drew on. I had many two charismatic grandmothers, a bunch of charismatic aunts, and even some sort of family friends. And so, I drew on those people in my life as I created the kind of amalgam version of Aunt Ursula. But she's very proper. She's formal in many ways. She still serves condiments in porcelain and dishware. She would never put like a bottle of ketchup on the table. You've got to serve it with spoons. So she's quite formal, but she's also sort of quirky and funny in her own way. So
Oh,
she's
she was. And as the book developed, her character developed because you saw her through your two other main characters, Larissa,
right.
who was her niece, and then there was Jack. If you want to share a little bit about who Jack is.
Yeah, so Jack is the longtime caretaker of the house. He lives in town. He's been the caretaker since he was 17, and he's in his 40s now, so a long time. So he's gotten to know the house inside and out, and almost has a sense of ownership about it. And not even almost, he really does have a kind of
Yeah.
a claim to it, you know.
Right.
And he and Ursula over the years became good friends.
Hmm.
They learned quite a lot from each other, I would say. And he has a set of fraternal triplet boys
Hmm.
that are just a fun kind of I'm a triplet myself, as you mentioned in the beginning, and I felt like one of the themes of the book is really identity and loss of identity,
Hmm.
and their inclusion in the book was a way to amplify that theme of identity.
Hmm.
Um, but he and his wife, he's struggling with his marriage. He wants it to work, but things aren't going well, and he and Larissa's lives sort of start to converge.
Hmm. Yeah. And what a setting. So the house. Let's talk about the house because the house is a character in the book, without a
Totally.
doubt.
Yeah. So the house is this Elmhurst, as I said, and named after this road the house on this road that my husband used to walk down, and I used to walk down, and it certainly is a character in the book. It's sort of this regal brick estate set among the elms. That's where the name also comes from, Elmhurst.
Hmm.
And it's kind of seen everything through the years. It's seen Larissa as a small child. It's seen Jack kind of evolve over the years, and it's seen Ursula through her days and also through her death. So we get a glimpse of that. And
Hmm.
there's a greenhouse that's attached to the house that houses a
Gorgeous.
very interesting
Your
plant.
writing was so spot on. I felt like I was in that conservatory, Jen.
I'm
It's
so glad.
so gorgeous. It was your description is just fabulous throughout the whole story. But sorry, go ahead. The conservatory was.
No, no, that's so kind of you to say. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I love descriptive writing. That's really where my heart is. So I spend a lot of time trying to craft the right description. So it's always so pleasing to me when somebody compliments them. But there's a conservatory where quite a bit of the action of the house takes place, and there's a really interesting plant there as well that all the characters have learned about, and it's called a night blooming cereus. And this is a plant that I knew about because my in-laws cultivated them, and
Oh,
I just was
wow.
fascinated by them. Yeah, and I have one. So this is a plant where, it's kind of looks sort of straggly and gangly much of the year. It sort of has these limbs that sort of grow out on these long limbs, and it might do nothing for many years. In fact, ours did nothing for 7 years, and then
Wow.
finally last September it started to get a little bud, and you can see that a bloom is going to come. And once you've cultivated them for a while, you might get multiple blooms, but we only got one bloom.
Mm.
And it will start to one day the bud will develop, and then one day the bloom will start to bloom in the morning. So we have these wonderful photographs of it starting to bloom around 9:30 a.m. and it's kind of just opened a little bit, and then middle of the day it's a little more, and then it literally takes all day to bloom, so that by 11:30 at night it's full bloom, and it's kind of the size of a small plate, and very fragrant, kind of a jasmine vanilla aroma. And so it's just amazing. And then but by the morning it's gone, it's kind of dropped to the um, floor again, or the windowsill where we have ours.
Mhm.
um, and so you'll see that plant in the book, and you'll get to see kind of what happens to it throughout the book.
And I found, the theme of flowers, and this plant, it was a metaphor
Sure. Yeah.
for Larissa's journey,
Yes.
and such a difficult journey she was experiencing. Can we talk a little bit about that, about her mom and father, who I found, your treatment of dementia, and that, role reversal with your children when that emerges in families was so heartbreaking, but so real. So
Yeah.
real, Jen.
Thank you. Yeah. To me, that's the heart of the book. That's what I wanted to write about in the book.
Hmm.
Um, so as I mentioned earlier, when Larissa takes the crowbar to the wall, she's really not herself. And I had this sense that as I was writing it, it's because she's struggling with her mother's health.
Hmm.
And this was a feeling that I really recognized, because it was a state that I felt when I was struggling with my mother's failing health. I
Hmm.
was 22 when she was diagnosed with breast cancer. I was 24 when she died, and so it was a very quick illness and then loss. Um, and I really wanted to explore how disorienting that can be. And I chose dementia because obviously it's a disease that deals with identity and loss of identity.
Hmm.
And I felt like Larissa. So we see the person who's suffering from the disease losing her identity,
Identity.
but I really wanted to explore the caretaker and the adult child. Even an adult child can really have this profound loss of self.
Mm.
I was driving recently, and it's funny, I was driving up to the North Shore, and recently they've changed the numbers on the exits.
Oh,
And so
wow.
these are these exit numbers that I've known for since I was learned to drive, right? And
Yeah.
even before, right?
Hmm.
And I found it so disorienting. I was like, oh my gosh, that's supposed to be exit 20A, but it's 40 whatever.
Hmm.
And that's a little bit what it's like, is like, so you sort of feel like I know the characters, I know the players, but something's really different, and it causes you to feel really disoriented and really lost in a way.
She
And
was
so
completely lost, and I have
yeah,
to tell you, I mean, I was so mad at her so many times.
yeah,
I was like,
readers, you might
"Stop
not
it!"
like her right away. Yeah,
Right,
yeah,
and I'm so glad that you said that out loud, because I'm thinking, oh my God, I'm so mad at this character. Get yourself together. But
right.
that was really the tragedy unfolding, that she
Yeah.
couldn't, and that's
It
what.
it's so hard to see the people that we love in pain, even though we know, of course, and of course Larissa loves her mother, and I shouldn't say of course, because there's some
Questionable
relationships that
points.
are
Yeah,
fraught, right?
yeah, yeah.
But in this case, she loves her mother and she wants to be helpful. It's just so painful for her to face it. So she's in this conflict of like, I want to be there for her, but it's so awful to see my mother deteriorate. And
Mm.
you had mentioned actually, and if you don't mind, I'll read this now.
Please.
So this is a quote from the book that comes to mind of the subject that we're talking about. She'd always thought of her parents as beacons in her life, but when one of those beacons when one of the coordinates by which she oriented herself ceased to exist, then who on earth was she?
See, that gives
And
me
this is what,
chills. That's such a
yeah,
gorgeous quote.
thank you.
It just, I wrote it down as soon as I read it. It was just like, it just hit my heart.
Right.
Yeah.
And we talked a little bit before we started about loss and grief and kind of what it feels like. And
Mhm.
that's it is and especially for a parent a child relationship where the reversal is so severe.
Mhm.
Sometimes you're having to do things that of course you need to do, but it's hard to do it as a child. Like, when, for instance, when my mother was ill, um she had gotten sick and I felt like I ought to call the doctor or even an ambulance, but she was screaming at me, Jennifer, do not call the ambulance. And I felt like, oh my God, I can't do it. I know that I should. And
Mhm.
if you had asked me ahead of time, I would have felt like, oh, I could do that. And I was in total stasis
Mhm.
because she was my mother and I was taught to respect her and she was telling me not to. And so it creates this very severe role reversal at times where you feel
Yeah.
like I need to do the right thing, and yet it's fraught with the kind of structure of this prior relationship and the change of the roles. Mhm.
Yeah. And you helped me to understand that, as the book progressed, and I was so relieved, and one of the main people, besides Jack and Ursula's backstory was her father,
Yeah,
who I just loved. Would you mind reading the quote that I had, also page 133, that I just found him? he
but I
he
have
was
that in the
so
book here too.
compassionate, and she was falling apart at the seams, and in the beginning of the book she's lying about this, and then one snowballing into another, and it just creates this fiasco that she just can't get herself out of. But he kept bringing her back and grounding her, and I feel like this scene was just amazing.
Yeah, he's very patient. He's very kind. My father was very positive and patient and
Mm.
kind. So I had some older, great uncle who was similar. So I channeled them for that role. But he is, and she's sort of unable to face her mother's illness, and he's trying to kind of bring her in a little bit.
Mhm.
I'm going to throw on my glasses here.
Okay.
Larissa sighed. I know, but I just always thought that mom would be there for me. I know I'm not a baby anymore. I'm old enough to take care of myself. But when I call her to chat, she can't stay focused. When I ask her advice, I'm greeted with silence. And somehow, I just don't know who to be without her. Clark sat on the side of the bed and put his arm around her. Don't torture yourself. She isn't gone yet. Larissa sighed. I know. Rationally, I know that. But if I stay away, it's almost like she is already gone. And then I don't have to watch her deteriorate. I don't have to experience all the awful moments. Larissa, honey, you can pretend this isn't happening, but that won't prevent it from actually happening. Those awful moments will come whether you choose to experience them or not. Our lives are different now, yes, but sometimes the truth isn't as bad as you think it will be. In the end, isn't it better to face it?
That was such a cathartic moment in the story, and for
Yeah.
me, because I think all of us have our stories, and it's a universal experience of loss. And his advice was just so spot on, and she was desperately, desperately trying to avoid it at all costs because it's so painful, right?
Right, right.
But it was just beautifully, beautifully done. And so the other things that came up through the story are love and romantic relationships too. And when you're trying to figure yourself out in the midst of figuring out, you carried that through beautifully. If you want to talk a little bit about that theme throughout the book.
Yeah, so, as I mentioned earlier, Larissa has broken up with her boyfriend in the beginning, but he kind of reemerges. And he's not a bad guy.
Mhm.
She loves him in a way, but in many ways she loves him actually, but she just isn't feeling kind of that I want to be with you forever love. And she's questioning, do I keep this or do I forsake this? And how do I decide that? And kind of why can't I be in love with him the way I want to be?
Oh,
I think we've all been in those relationships where we think, God, I love this person, but it is not working. It
yeah,
isn't enough.
yeah.
And that is so frustrating. It's heartbreaking, right?
Yeah.
So, but at a moment where she's really unable to face her mother's illness, she needs to learn to let go of controlling kind of all of her relationships. So she's trying to control her connection with her ex-boyfriend, and she's kind of trying to control her connection with her parents. And ultimately, it's really a story about her learning. I've got to let go. I don't have control over everything, and I've got to face these vulnerabilities. Even though that might be scary, in the end, it's actually really redemptive.
It was so redemptive, and I think again, bringing it back to this, the flower, the natural rhythm of life. You just even your chapters, you set them through the seasons of our life, fall,
Right.
which another is another metaphor for the heart of your story, I feel.
Yeah. No, no, no. Right. I'm glad you touched on that. Yeah. So my brain tends to work in sort of almost like a play structure, like acts or
Yes.
parts. So this book is written in three parts,
Mhm.
and the first part is fall, then there's winter, then there's spring,
Mhm.
and you don't get summer. The story doesn't continue into summer, but I feel like it's kind of implied and that
Yes.
it's coming,
Mhm.
and so
Yes.
the first part in the fall is sort of Larissa's totally lost, and she's returned to her hometown. It's the return moment, but she's lost. And then the second part is she goes to New Hampshire to visit her parents, and she sort of is now deeper into her loss of self.
Mhm.
And then the third part is kind of the return back to home and the return to self.
Yes.
So, I would mention that ultimately it is a really hopeful book. It does deal with some challenging topics, but I think in the end, I think one of the lessons anyway is that um, by sort of connecting with those we love and facing our vulnerabilities, that's how we find, redemption and renewal, and a way forward.
That encapsulates it so beautifully. And I,
Thank you.
I think, it also spoke to, the importance of living in the moment. We only get this one day, and the impermanence, which again is that
Yes.
reference with that, serious flower, which was just gorgeous. I would love
Yes.
to see and smell one someday in my life.
Yes. No, I'll send you a photo.
That
They're
would be
cool.
great.
Yeah.
So we're kind of coming to the end of our time together. This was fabulous.
Oh, so
Again,
nice to chat.
the book is The Little French Bridal Shop, which is glorious.
I
Jen,
have it here.
share with people how they can get in touch with you, our listeners, where they can get your book, what's coming up, for you, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So my website is jenniferdupee.com. Jennifer with two N's. My last name is Dupee, Dupee. And that front landing page there will have many options for purchasing the book. So Amazon, Bookshop, IndieBound. And then I think, depending on where you are, you may even find it on the shelves of your local bookshop. So I always like it when people support local.
Absolutely, me too. Hmm.
And then I have an event coming up actually just this Friday. So Friday, let's see, the 19th of March, I'm doing an event with Maya Lang, who's written a lovely, lovely memoir. It came out last year, and her paperback is coming out in April,
Mm.
called "What We Carry," about her mother's struggle with dementia. And hers is almost like an inverse story to mine, where in mine, Larissa's sort of finding herself, but in Maya's book, her mother is Maya discovers some secrets that she didn't know about her mother that kind of
Oh,
come to light as
fascinating.
it's a great, great memoir, and it's beautifully, beautifully written. So that will be Friday, and the link is on my website. So if you care to tune in, then I'd love to have you.
Great. Well, this has been great. Thank you so
It's
much,
been
Jennifer.
fantastic. Thank you,
And
Lori.
yep, you're welcome. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. Have a great day.